What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Park Score podcast, the greatest podcast on the entire interwebs. Today, I've got my guy Charlie. He's back again. We're here to talk about Ray Peat again. Charlie, how you been?
Hey Parks, been doing well. You didn't get too much of me last time.
That's right. That's right. We had to microdose you for the first episode, but they're gonna get the full macrodose this time. We're gonna be digging into Ray Peat again. This time, we're gonna be talking about Ray Peat and bodybuilding, peating and bodybuilding.
Yeah, I mean, last time we went pretty philosophical. We were getting into some of Pete's intellectual influences and sort of the ideas and generative energy behind the Vernadsky and where does life originate? How does it play out? But this time I think we can get a little bit more practical, and so maybe we'll hold people's attention a little longer because I think a lot of people can relate to this experience of finding the ideas of Ray Peat, getting excited about them, rushing to implement them, and then you end up with sort of like the equivalent of the freshman 15 or something, but for peating, and it's like, wait, what's going on? I thought this was just supposed to make me more energetic, and so why am I gaining weight? Why am I all kinds of problems you can run into. But I think that that's one of the more sort of universal things is like, I tried peating, but I got fat because I was, eating too much sugar and whatever it might be.
Right.
But yeah, I'm a little curious to actually hear more of sort of your baseline experience or how you've encountered that in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, today, obviously, we're gonna, like you said, it's gonna be a lot more sort of practical advice for people, and we're gonna kind of be taking the philosophy of the previous episode on Ray Peat, and we're gonna be applying it to things like, bodybuilding, things like weightlifting, things like performance, raising your energy levels, things like body composition. We're going to be really trying to get into the nitty gritty of things. And, it's not always super straightforward trying to do that with Pete's work, because as you said, a lot of times people just try to go at it with, the few things that they've gleaned offline, and then they end up sort of totally, totally wrecking themselves, in the process. But we're here to kind of give some of our personal experience and kind of just lay out some general principles to consider. As for you, what were you introduced to first, bodybuilding or peating?
I would say I had an interest in kind of peak performance or like being in a trying to get into a like peak physical condition, mostly from sort of like a performance standpoint, like wanting to look good, yes, but also wanting to be able to be as one of my kind of idols from the world of fitness says, be strong to be useful. That was Georges Hebert, who was a French naval officer and kind of the precursor to the modern parkour school, which later evolved into MoveNat, the natural method for training. And I dabbled in CrossFit and things like that. And of course, in those circles, you also have some overlap where people are talking a lot about principles of diet and nutrition and body composition, partly as a means to an end and also as an end in and of itself. So, like I remember when I was getting into paleo, this was back in maybe like 2009, 2010. The line in Mark Sisson's Primal Blueprint was like looking good naked. That was kind of one of the many benefits that was supposed to come about from reverting to this more natural expression of the human epigenome that, if you eat the right things and move in the right ways, get outside, playful movement. And there's a lot in Mark Sisson that I still subscribe to. And I think a lot that the paleo world got right. And that template worked pretty well for me for a really long time. I overcame some chronic illness type, chronic fatigue symptoms by going paleo. And whether that was a result of just eliminating some of the toxins that, overlaps with the Ray Peat framework, saying, get rid of polyunsaturated fats, or at least, radically change up the ratio of polyunsaturated fat to other healthier kinds of fats, getting rid of all sorts of seeds and nuts and like actually in paleo that might get a little bit contested. And then the more you go down that list, you'll find a lot of areas where You get Pete pilled a second time after being red pilled by paleo, coming off of the standard American diet. You might find that Ray Pete ends up Pete pilling you into, okay, wait a minute, now I have to go back and reassess sugar, reassess dairy, all these things. And so it was a gradual evolution for me. I never went like really strict paleo, kind of like Whole 30. I always maintained a little bit of cream, a little bit of, sugar and honey and ice cream and things like that as a treat. So it was a very welcome paradigm shift to realize that maybe I could still keep what had originally been effective for me from paleo, but also allow back in some of these things that were forbidden under the paleo romance perspective.
Yeah. And so, so I mean, just to give kind of a little bit of a personal background on my experience, because the way I'm sort of coming at this is, I've taken in a few ideas of Pete, but I think, where I'm at in my training and my diet right now, I think I definitely could dial it in some more if I understood Pete on maybe a deeper level. And a lot of what I'm kind of here to do today is I want to kind of put some things in front of you and get your feedback. So, just to give a quick little summary of my personal story getting into Ray Peat. So obviously in high school, I ran cross country, was super into cross country. Anyone who knows a lot about Pete knows that super high endurance cardio can sort of be problematic from a Pete perspective. But I loved it. It was like, my passion and stuff. I ended up having to quit doing it because of a heart condition that I had. And then my buddies were like, "Oh, dude, just come do lifting, come do lifting." And I was like, I had some of that mimetic desire going on. My buddies, they were getting jacked in the gym. So we, senior year, we got super into lifting. And then all through college, I was super vain and I was just like, yeah, lifting, super hardcore, went into lifting and did the whole dirty bulk like a retard thing. Just completely went at it the wrong way. Totally spun my wheels for years and years and years. And then finally, probably around, I would say, maybe senior year of college, I started to piece things together, like you said, understanding a little bit more about diets, but coming at it from more of a like I don't know about you, but I was on, right wing bodybuilder Twitter, and the whole thing was just like, yeah, dude, if you just slonk raw eggs, if you slonk 5 raw eggs per day, and you just get your protein, you're good, bro, and stay away from seed oils. They couldn't necessarily, no one actually told me why seed oils were bad. I just knew that, if you eat seed oils, you're gay. So I stood away, I stayed away from them. But I learned some principles there because I think there was a lot of overlap between that community online, that sort of soul bra, Bronze Age pervert community online, and the Ray Pete sphere. And it wasn't until probably senior year of college, I started getting into things like peptides. And I ended up taking something called Cardarine because I wanted to be exotically lean. And I bought this Cardarine off of a, illegal website. And
That was from their marketing language, exotically lean, or was that your own projection?
that was, so I had a friend. So I always wanted the lean look. I never wanted to be super big, right? I always wanted to be super dry. And I had a friend, he actually, like, after I was taking the Cardarine, he told me, he was like, dude, your arms look like a reptile. So, like, reptile, they gave me the nickname reptile for a little bit. But then I started having bad side effects from that. I think we went over this some in the previous podcast, but started getting yellowing of the vision. And obviously, looking back now with the Pete perspective in mind, a lot of that probably came from the fact that this peptide or this drug Cardarine, it causes things like I think it was essentially where your body converts, to using like fat primarily
Hmm.
for fuel. So that like rather than carbs. And yeah, it was a mess. And I was constantly in a calorie deficit, driving down my metabolism massively. And finally, I kind of got to a point where my strength was tanked. It was had all these chronic sort of injuries and stuff. And finally, I got out of college. I took a step back from all my friends and the sort of mimetic desire that was in that bodybuilding house, and I kind of stumbled upon generative energy. And I read Pete's work, Generative Energy, actually not to really dig into the work of Pete. I was actually wanting to do a novel, like a dramatization of my time in that house, getting sucked into right wing bodybuilding. And Bronze Age Pervert had talked about Ray Peat in Bronze Age Mindset. And I was like, Ray Peat, this name keeps coming up. I want to understand this guy on a deeper level. So I dug into generative energy and I realized there, much along the same lines as you, it's not as simple as, oh, just eat real food, bro. Just eat real food, bro. That's what you hear online. Eat real food, bro. Pete goes into it a little bit more in depth than that. And so yeah, hopefully today you'll be able to kind of elucidate for us, how people can avoid falling into similar pitfalls, if they're kind of wanting to get the best of both worlds.
For sure. And I think maybe we can take this as an opportunity to try to use Pete's ideas to restore bodybuilding to sanity to some extent. I think that what can be gleaned from the bodybuilding community and the obscure forums is an idea taken to its logical extreme, which is, the idea of the human body having some sort of maybe a epitome or ideal, which in the exaggerated form looks like the freaks that you see on the magazines at the grocery store, Mr. Olympia or something like that. But if we dial that back just a couple of clicks, maybe we land on something more like the Statue of David and this beautiful physique that follows the golden ratio in some of its proportions because it represents a healthy body. And in modern times, it's very rare to see people that even come close to approximating the Grecian ideal. So, if we are taking as our aim a healthy, functional physique where the form follows the function, we can say, all right, so we want a certain amount of lean muscle mass. We want it to be purposeful, proportional, and what kinds of principles can we bring to bear to get that without compromising our energy or our longevity. Because I think, we could probably imagine if we had infinite time, we could, spend all our time in the gym and really get obsessed and neurotic about it. And that's one of the virtues and shortcomings of the kind of hyper online, maybe slightly autistic, but bodybuilding community is like its obsession and its
Right.
obsession with detail, and it does share that in common.
Right.
Also with Ray Peat, I think is there's this like nerdiness combined with the practical application of physiology, and I think in one of his writings, Ray Peat talked about kind of working towards a technology of life, practical application of things that maybe had previously only been considered to be the realm of sort of woo-woo, hand waving type explanations. So
Mhm.
we're going to try to get through as much as we can with a minimum of hand waving and jargon. So I mean, I've got sort of some notes that I could. I don't want to be reading off of a script, but I do think if we want to give this a little bit of structure, I would kind of want to break it down into three main planks and see if we can carve out a little bit of time on each one of these planks, all of which are geared towards the basic idea of the metabolic rate, this sort of central Peatian concept of increasing your body's rate of caloric burn, as opposed to I think the prevailing worldview, which has basically sort of taken calories in, calories out as a reason for restricting calories and trying to out exercise your diet,
Right.
burn more than you take in rather than saying, no, I'm actually going to take in more in order to burn more.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and well, really quickly on that note, the whole calories in and calories out thing. That's a super simplistic way to look at it. Well, if I'm taking in less energy than I'm burning, then I should lose weight. But how many times have we heard people online lament that, well, I tracked all my calories and I'm eating in a deficit and I didn't lose any weight or I gained weight. And a lot of times people online will malign them and say, oh, well, you must not be counting it correctly or you're lying.
Right.
And in some cases, this might be the case. But I think also, too, I think the metabolic rate is something that is vastly understated. I think it's something that if you want to understand Pete's work and you want to understand how to actually get control of things like body composition or even things like just losing weight or even gaining weight or just being a high energy individual, metabolic rate is not something you can ignore. And so I'm really glad you brought that up.
Right, right. So I propose kind of the three planks, and we'll get into a little more about the problem with calories in, calories out. But I want to break it down into three planks. The first one being dealing with our toxic environment and reducing the load of toxins that's coming into our bodies, and dealing with the toxins that are already in our bodies that have accumulated from years of living in this poisoned environment. The second one is broadly going to be just about hormonal optimization. And of course, these are all going to bleed together, and everything in
Right.
once you start going down the rabbit hole of physiology, you start to realize just how interconnected everything is. And
Right.
it's especially true when you start talking about hormones and the relationships between hormones. So this will also have some bearing on the third one, which is more about the movement and exercise component, which I think gets discussed probably the least by Peat himself. He does comment on it, and he does have a whole philosophy and worldview around what is sort of appropriate for for a human being, what kinds of movement. And I think he really shies away from the whole concept and category of exercise, which poses a challenge to traditional bodybuilding culture, which
Right.
is very much centered around doing exercises for a specific result. But I think that we can kind of synthesize those into some sort of a uh, perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So
So
go ahead.
yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was gonna say just let's go ahead and jump in. I'm excited to hear it.
All right. And yeah, I think just to fill out a little bit more of the problem with the calories in, calories out perspective, the basic idea here is that if you are restricting calories, your body is going to perceive that as a starvation threat. And in response, it's going to downregulate or lower your basal metabolic rate, how much energy your body is burning just when it's resting. And you're going into conservation mode as opposed to living in this sort of abundance mode. It's more than just a mindset. It's an actual sort of physiological state where your body is sending the signals that it is taken care of. It can explore. If you take the paleo framing, you would say when you're maybe when your cells are filled with energy, that's a signal that you can go out and explore new territory or invest more in building up the local camp. You're not just you're not in famine mode.
Mhm.
So this is where you can kind of imagine. And I did a little experiment the other day with ChatGPT just to see if it could generate a couple of graphs showing what this looks like kind of in stark terms. The conventional calories in, calories out model, where you're trying to operate at a caloric deficit. That here's calories in and here's calories out. You're trying to out exercise. If you're trying to operate like this, your body is going to downregulate its metabolism, and eventually you're going to be. It's like working against entropy, where those things are just going to kind of push towards each other. Whereas in the pro metabolic view, let's say you're just trying to get them to be equal, but at a higher level. So you're taking in more, but you're also burning more. And maybe you're just trying to have it so that if you're trying to lose weight, if you're trying to get out of a sort of steady state, maybe you bump it up so that you are uh, burning just or consuming just a little bit less than you're burning. But this mode here, where if you zoom in, you can just see a slight little difference at the top there. That's going to be a more sustainable weight loss paradigm than trying to be down here with that bigger gap, where maybe in the first 3 days you're dropping, a pound a day.
Mhm.
And the reasons for that, there's many reasons why we don't want to be operating down here. One is that it's going to lower your metabolic rate, but
Right.
there's also dangers to things like oxidizing too much fat for fuel. And you mentioned, what was the name of that supplement?
Cardarine, yeah. So the whole purpose of cardarine was to make you exotically lean, and the essentially the pathway that it did this through was through mainly shifting the body's fuel source into fats, and it had a whole host of negative side effects. Namely, it affected eye health. It did things like it caused insomnia. And the insomnia actually, this is interesting, was a result of like a heightened stress response. So the body is just constantly stressed as a result of kind of being in the state where fat is being used as fuel. And it's interesting because keto is something that a lot of people will opt to. It's a big fad diet. It's not as big of a fad as it used to be, but the whole idea with keto is we got to get into ketosis, man. Gotta if I eat any carbs, I'm not gonna be in ketosis anymore. And the whole thing about getting into ketosis is just depriving your body of carbs and sugar, to the point where your body says, okay, we're entering starvation mode. We have to start using a different fuel source, that fuel source being fat. And this is obviously highly stressful to the body. A lot of times people will get on keto and they'll say, oh yeah, as long as you get past the first 2 weeks of, flu symptoms, you should be good. You should be good to go. But obviously, from a Pete perspective, you're like you said, you're taking an approach that maybe is going to yield some of the result that you want in the short term, but long term, it's not really something that is super sustainable. And I would say that the goal of implementing peating into your bodybuilding routine or just your fitness regimen in general is to have just better long-term outcomes, and not have these increasingly shrinking capacities.
Right, right. No, and that's actually that's a big chunk of my notes here is just on it's a difficult concept, and I think that it also is at odds with a lot of people's experience of long-term success on keto. And I had pretty long periods of time where I was eating lower carb, not strictly keto, and maybe that was
Same here.
partly what explained the fact that I tolerated it was that I never did operate for long periods of time in true ketosis. But I think you find a lot of people say, hey, I went keto or carnivore and a lot of my digestive problems resolved. Uh, they find that they're just a lot healthier and their energy levels are stable. So this is potentially a conflict that how do you resolve that? And I don't know. Would you say have you heard from people that have had success stories, or most of the stories you're hearing about keto from like ex-keto people?
Well, so the one thing I'll say about keto is I think it definitely has some promise in an environment where, most people's sources of carbs are not going to necessarily be things that are very high quality sources. Not only that, but typically these these sources are laden with seed oils. And a big thing with keto is people will sometimes just jump straight from keto to like carnivore. And a big thing with carnivore obviously is you're getting a ton of animal proteins and a ton of animal fats. And we know from a peating perspective that this is actually a good thing. And so if somebody's going from eating no animal proteins and no animal fats to eating a high concentration of them and just cutting out carbs, well, then it's sort of it's a give and a take. The problems that they were having before with poor digestion and things like that, obviously those are going to go away, because you're taking on a whole new, you're kind of taking on a whole new set of benefits and also problems. And so the thing with Pete is, not to go super extreme in one direction or the other. It's to kind of, I would say, to eat intuitively and to eat in a way that the body was sort of ready made to utilize energy in. One thing that was super shocking to me is I was very low carb for a long time because, again, I was trying to shoot for this super exotically lean physique. And what I didn't even realize until, maybe the last year is that, guys, if you want like a good pump, you want your muscles to look full and you want to be high energy, going high carb is actually a lot better than trying to go low carb for those sorts of things. And a lot of P2, I think it's the quality of the macronutrients too that can have an effect. But obviously, you're more of the expert in this domain than I am, so I'm kind of more interested to hear like what you would have to say. But yeah, I don't know if you kind of want to take it from there.
Yeah, and I'm not going to express a strong opinion on this because, like I say, I had probably more success from a strict body composition standpoint going low carb than I have on eating much peatier for the past, let's just say, year or two, incrementally and in different ways. But I think that I'll present what I understand to be Pete's argument against ketosis is partly that it's a more primitive metabolic state, that the pathways are ones that organisms evolved kind of earlier on, and they are less efficient. It kind of takes more energy to produce ATP that way, as opposed to the glucose burning pathways, which were developed relatively later in our evolutionary history and require. And actually, this is one where we could maybe get into the whole debate about evolution, because I don't even know that that's essential for this framework to really make sense. But I think, the idea is, okay, it works as a backup. It's a sort of good survival mechanism. If you need to fall back on the more primitive state, then that could be just fine. But if you're in it long term, if you're forcing your metabolism to constantly be converting, protein and amino acids and glycerol. I don't even know the exact chemical breakdown of gluconeogenesis, but basically it's the way that your body makes glucose from other sources when it's not available. The brain needs a certain amount of glucose, and I think even maybe ketones substitute for that for people in ketosis. But this idea that we are if we have it available, sugar is a very good way to have just a clean burning source of fuel that doesn't take much energy in processing it, doesn't take all that much energy. But I think where most people run into trouble, and this is where we start to get into, well, maybe we'll start with the hormonal things before we talk about the toxic environment. Because I
Right.
think that the elephant in the room is like somebody's been on a high fat diet for a long time. They're moving from this restrictive desert of carnivore into this sort of no worries, paradise of bioenergetics, and they're just going to eat sugar and fruit and be happy finally after years of deprivation. The big pitfall here is that people will often continue their high fat eating habits from keto and carnivore while adding carbohydrates back
Yeah.
in. And this is sort of like the autumnal diet. I encountered the idea of the anti-autumnal diet from the bodybuilding world. It's this idea that you want to separate your carbs and fat, unlike an animal that's preparing for autumn, preparing for or that's preparing for winter. So in autumn, bears will eat bear, stocking up on all this fat and sugar combined so that they can just pack on fat to survive through the winter time. So if you're trying to reverse that, you separate those out, and you make sure that if you're eating fat, you're not eating it with carbs. And if you're eating carbs, you're not eating that with fat. And I've seen a lot more awareness of this, both in the low carb world understands this through the lens of the insulin hypothesis, that sugar spikes your insulin. And if you're eating fat while your insulin is spiked, then your cells are going to get the signal to just shuttle all that fat directly into the cells rather than burn it. But you can also approach this from the other side, which is the kind of the Randall cycle or the Randall effect, which basically says that fat and carbs are antagonistic substrates of energy that the body does not like to be burning them simultaneously, and they would kind of frame it. I think Peat would frame it in the inverse of the insulin hypothesis, that it's you can't burn sugar in the presence of too much fat. So if you exceed, let's say 25, 30% of your calories as fat, suddenly that's going to inhibit sugar burning, and vice versa. If you're, if I think both people in the keto world and people that are moving more towards a higher carb, higher sugar approach can relate to this. That if you try to mix it all up, if you live in the swamp of fat and sugar combined, then you feel sort of sluggish. It's almost like you feel your cellular machinery slowing down as it tries to process both of these things at once.
Mhm.
And you want to take it to the extreme, just eat like a piece of pizza with thick greasy cheese on it, and then that bread, and like it just you can feel your blood vessels kind of clogging up just thinking about it, right?
Right. Right. I had pizza for lunch today also, and then hamburgers. One thing I wanted to ask is, so, okay, let's say, because I've been trying to opt for this thing where I'm trying to do, because I started tracking my macros more closely recently, and I'm realizing I'm just eating way too much fat. Like I'm eating more than 30% of my macros per day of fat. So I've been trying to pay attention to it a little bit more. I've been bulking, so I've been, allowing myself a little bit of leeway, but, But so my question is, so like the other day I went to Chili's and I got home and I logged the calories and I realized like, dude, I just hit my PUFA budget for like the month.
Hmm.
And so what would you do in a case where I'm just gonna throw this curveball at you? What would you do in a case where you've had some like acute consumption of PUFA one day, which for those of the uninitiated in the audience, that's polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is seed oils, or it's a roundabout way of saying seed oils. It's the type of fat you really don't want to be consuming, especially if you're trying to do the sort of PD way of eating. So what would you do if accidentally uh learn that you ingested like let's say you ingested like 100 grams of PUFA all at once. You get home, you realize it. What do you do in that scenario? And from a Pete perspective, what can you do?
Right, right. I mean, I guess first there's like the EpiPen. You get the
Yeah.
no, you grab the avocado oil or the vitamin E. Vitamin E is known to have some protective effects against the sort of acute exposure.
Mm,
I've been looking into, and I'd like to do more research into what a solid PUFA depletion plan would look like.
mm,
But I think that you have to start to broaden your time scale and
mm,
stop thinking in terms of what can I do this week and
mm,
start to think more in terms of what am I going to do this month, this year, and for the next 10 years.
mm,
And I think that however much the anti-seed oil community has stigmatized or maybe from an outside perspective, like has gone overboard in its demonization of seed oils, there's a sense in which we can never go far enough because this still happens to all of us. That maybe we're with family or we just choose convenience and we go out
yeah.
to the restaurant and we feel terrible for like the next 24 to 36 hours,
Yeah.
or our immune systems collapse. And this is also, I think, one of the tricky things about eliminating toxins is that you become more sensitive to them in those acute exposures.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There was a podcast that David Gornosky did with Metabolic Uncle, who's another one of these kind of Pete inspired figures that has made a name for himself a little bit independently of Pete, but using the same principles. It tells a story about after eliminating PUFAs for some extended period of time, just going out to an Indian restaurant and yeah, getting that acute overdose. But I think we didn't get ourselves into this situation overnight, and we're not going to get ourselves out of it overnight either.
Yeah.
It starts at home with what you buy at the grocery store and what you bring through the threshold of your home. And if you kind of think about that gateway, that threshold as like a sacred thing that you're just not going to bring any PUFAs into your home, basically. And I shouldn't say that because I was just eating pork rinds and like Ray Peat did it. He was known to enjoy fried chicken livers
Yeah.
and chickens, pigs. These don't contain seed oils themselves, but they're sort of seed eating animals, and so you get it both through the animals that consume uh, foods that are high in linoleic acid, which is pretty much the same thing as polyunsaturated fat. It's the omega-3, 6, 9. And it really does all kind of come like, if you read Mark Sisson, Primal Blueprint, like a lot of this stuff has been well known in kind of alternative health circles for a very long time. Uh, but the detox protocol might look like just lowering overall fat intake, but the thing is, if you go if you try to just purge your cells of this stuff quickly, then they end up getting and here, forgive me if my jargon is incorrect or just too jargony, but I think that you know Pete was against the oxidation of body fat, where it goes into the bloodstream as free fatty acids,
Mm,
kind of free floating fatty, I don't know, FFAs, but free fatty acids, which if you are like most people, kind of if you've accumulated a lifetime store of PUFAs on your body, then when those get oxidized and go into your bloodstream, they can wreak all kinds of havoc that way. So we want to avoid that rapid oxidization, and instead, again, it's that just be constantly burning a little bit more energy than you're taking in. Don't try to get over here where you suddenly purge all that fat at once.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And
Deplete it slowly. And mainly it's about just reducing the intake. Because I think that it might take somewhere on the order of like 3 to 5 years for your fat cells to completely turn over.
mm,
But and this is actually another good place to bring up the idea of this streaming renewal of substance. Structure and energy are interrelated at every level. And so the body is constantly turning over. And if you have a high metabolic rate, the structure of every cell of your body is going to be turning over a period of years. You're not the same person that you were 5 years ago at the cellular level.
right.
Every cell, I think, maybe except for some brain cells, have turned over by that point.
Right. On the topic of being more and more sensitive to seed oils over time, I have actually noticed this, and I don't know if this is something that happens to everyone, but so I've been like kind of woke to the seed oil thing for, I don't know, at this point, probably since 2018. So I've tried to stay away from them. I'm not super diligent or anything like that, but one thing I have noticed lately, especially since I've been married, um, if I have like a super high PUFA day the day before, I wake up with a splitting headache. Like it's like clockwork. It's like every single time just splitting headache the next morning, worse than a hangover. And it's crazy. And so but we I want to talk a little bit about hormone optimization because this is one thing that obviously if a person's getting into bodybuilding and stuff, it's pretty obvious that oh, if I have more testosterone, it's going to be easier to put on muscle, right? That was my big revelation as a young lifter, where I essentially realized, oh, if my hormones are properly optimized, if my hormones are in a good place, then it's going to be easier for me to get the sort of outcome that I want out of my body composition. Now, whenever you're taking a super straightforward approach to this might be as simple as, oh, let me just take some over-the-counter testosterone boosters, or let me just, the solution in the mind of the uninitiated is always just, oh, just more test, bruh. But can you kind of talk about how, you know, how the Peat approach to hormone optimization might look a little bit different?
Sure. And I think the word optimization gets thrown around a lot in like the Tim Ferriss crowd. Everything's all about optimization, but it does have a specific meaning in this context, which is certain hormones you want to maximize, certain hormones you want to minimize, and other hormones you neither want to maximize nor minimize. You want to optimize them. You want to use them for the positive effects that they can have while minimizing the negative effects. And so like starting off with a hormone that we want to minimize. Let's just take something like cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and plays a big role in Ray Peat's framework that, when we become kind of dominated by estrogen and cortisol. There's kind of these different axes of hormones. With on the positive side, you have progesterone and pregnenolone, all these sort of steroidal hormones that are associated with well-oiled machine, properly functioning thyroid, things like that. And then you have the sort of like the stress pathways, the estrogen dominance, the cortisol. So like by and large, I think we can say you want to minimize cortisol, and carbs, sugar. That's one way to do that. Sugar suppresses cortisol, and if you're drinking coffee, for example, you might otherwise get a cortisol spike unless you have some of the blunting effects of sugar in your coffee, maybe a little cream too, to just sort of slow down the absorption of that sugar, so you're not spiking what's it called? The glycemic load. You're not spiking your insulin too quickly. Um,
Can I give a little note on coffee real quick? So
Please.
so Pete actually, I was a big coffee drinker always, and I've always favored the speedier class. of drug. And so whenever I was getting into, lifting and stuff like that, obviously pre-workout, caffeine, abusing caffeine is like a big thing. Well, I came across a Pete video where he kind of talks about how a lot of people will approach things like caffeine and coffee as like a legal form of speed, and how, from a Pete perspective, this is absolutely not, how you want to approach it necessarily. A lot of people will drink it on an empty stomach and they'll get all wired up, and then
Right.
they'll have some sort of a crash or something. But the as you said, the PD approach to something like coffee is, it's going to spike your cortisol, which is where you get that sort of wiry sort of feeling from it, unless it has some sort of glycogen to utilize, which is where putting sugar in your coffee comes in, or just being at a like glycogen replete state. And one thing that I've noticed is since I've started trying to eat in a more PD way, or making sure that I have some like milk with my coffee or some sort of sugar with my coffee, I'm able to drink coffee all day pretty much, and I get a much smoother sort of a benefit from it. It's not that cracked out, wiry feeling. And Pete said coffee is something you approach more like a vitamin.
A vitamin, right.
Yeah, and that's just a game changer for me once I realized that. But anyways, I wanted to interject that. Um,
Yeah, no, I don't even I'm not all that well versed in what makes coffee a particularly effective vitamin. I just know that it makes me feel good. It
yeah.
makes me happier, and it's not without its side effects. But I do think a lot of those side effects come from not having the metabolic support
Mhm.
to to kind of carry uh, the speedier effects.
Mhm.
And this is where I want to introduce this book that I discovered, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and it took me a while to really catch on to it. I had it on my bookshelf forever before I actually opened it up, but now it's probably one of my more dog-eared, highlighted copies. And my magic trick, my party trick is I'm going to open this book to a random page and we'll see if it has anything to say about and note here. I don't have my hands in it anywhere. I'm just letting it open to a random page. It's not actually random, but this is the graph that I always come back to, and this is not going to be super visible, so I can send you a screenshot if you want to put it into the show notes. But this is basically, and it might also be reversed. This is the hormone optimization chart from Rob Fagan's Natural Hormone Enhancement, written in the year 2000, much simpler times. It looks like it was done with like clip art and self-published, but it's really got a lot of gems, and a lot of it does align with Pete's sort of hormone first approach. But the natural hormones enhancement strategy in a nutshell is to break down. So he focuses on five hormones: growth hormone, testosterone, insulin, glucagon, and cortisol. We already talked about cortisol a little bit. Cortisol is bad. We want to minimize it, and that's a slight oversimplification. But a lot of these things, it can actually help. Like like
Yeah,
good, bad,
yeah, absolutely.
and in this case, cortisol is something that he identifies as being both catabolic and lipogenic, meaning it breaks down catabolic, breaks down lean muscle tissue, and then lipogenic, it tends towards storing fat. So when your cortisol levels are higher, you're going to store more, especially abdominal fat. Um, Whereas, and that's the only one that falls into that bad area, but that means we want to just suppress it. When it comes to something like growth hormone, well, that's anabolic. Um, and it all well, actually let's do testosterone next because testosterone is kind of the inverse of cortisol. It's both anabolic and lipolytic, meaning it tends to build up muscle tissue and break down fat. The lipolytic, that's a little bit of a double-edged sword because if you have too much lipolysis, again, you're getting the free fatty acids and the oxidation of fat, which maybe can have some unintended side effects. But if we just take that word to mean like it tends towards burning of fat. Okay. So testosterone is good. We want to enhance that, upregulate it. But something like something like insulin is a double-edged sword because it is anabolic. It will build up your muscle tissue, but it's also lipogenic. So it doesn't really discriminate what kinds of tissue it builds up. It's going to build up both fat and muscle. And if you're eating a very anabolic diet, it's high in protein, fat, and carbs, you're just loading it all onto your plate. Yeah, you're going to gain some muscle, but if you want a shredded muscular look, you need to have periods where you're optimizing insulin. You're not always going high on insulin. You're not trying to just enhance it or suppress it. You're cycling in different phases. And so this is where we could kind of get into the conversation about macronutrient cycling and timing of these things, and that whole conversation has to do again with the Randall cycle and that antagonism of fat and sugar as fuel substrates, fuel sources. Uh, I'll pause there.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. So speaking of things like macro timing and stuff, you hit on it earlier, but one of the earliest things that I ever heard from a woman bodybuilder back in my hometown. I was a kid then. I wasn't even trying to bodybuild back then, but I always remember hearing this. She told my mom, she said, never eat carbs and fats at the same time because it'll go straight to your hips. It'll go straight to your belly. And I never knew the context of this, and I never knew if it was true or not. I could never tell. But years and years and years later, I would come to learn that there actually is some truth to this. There's some sort of folk wisdom, colloquial wisdom that hits on things that are peaty every now and then. And so, yeah, if you want to kind of talk to us a little bit about things like macro timing and things like honestly just macros in general, and kind of how to think about them and how to approach them from a PD perspective while trying to get sort of good, body comp outcomes.
Right. And so this is where I'm going to try to bring some nuance that maybe I have yet to even fully realize in my life because I've tried multiple different schemes, I'll call them, for chronometric separation, that is separation in time of fat and carbs. The main one that I tried was kind of uh, you could call it carb cycling or uh, you know, ketosis cycling, where, and actually what Fagan recommends in this book is doing 3 to 4 days of a high fat, low carb, moderate to high protein, followed by one meal upcycle, carb upcycle, where you consume just like a ridiculous amount of carbs, lower the fat for that meal, and then you take the overnight period to sort of bring insulin back down so you can go right back into that down cycle again, eating ketogenic again, eating high fat while your insulin's no longer spiked the next day. And I've tried that maybe with some minimal success, but it always feels like I don't really want to be counting days. And if I, being married, it's like my wife doesn't want to have to be thinking about, oh, what's today? Is today a day
Right.
when I can cook this kind of meal or that kind of meal?
Right.
So I find that a lot of this is, yeah, if I were competing in bodybuilding competitions, maybe I would get really strict about this. But if I just want to maintain a healthy body composition, I'm actually leaning more and more towards what Pete favored, which is generally balanced macronutrient ratios and thinking in terms of what are your body's requirements for, first of all, kind of the basic building blocks for your tissues. How much protein do you need? And I think, his recommendation tended to be around like for an average adult, maybe 100 grams per day, which is significant. Like it's, in really serious weightlifting and bodybuilding circles, they might say 1 gram per pound of body weight. So as a 160-pound man, I should be eating 160 grams of protein, which I don't know. I mean, if we punch that into ChatGPT, like,
Can
what
I?
is 160 grams of protein a day actually look like in terms of what I would need to eat?
Right.
That is probably going to be, let's see what it says. It would be, let's see, 8 ounces of chicken breast, 4 whole eggs, 2 cups of Greek yogurt, 6 ounces of ground beef. I don't know. I mean, that actually sounds relatively reasonable. Um, but
So,
just, yeah.
oh, sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I mean, I just sort of taking 100 grams as our baseline. Um, this sort of seems reasonable to me, and whether you're getting it from again, to use Pete's framework, you'd want to be getting it from things like milk, maybe skim milk so you're not getting too much fat with it, but uh, cheese, especially hard cheeses, uh, o- some organ meats, but and oysters, but those things kind of used sparingly. And then collagenous cuts of meat, sure, yogurt, things like that. But yeah, dairy, not getting it from nuts and also not too much from muscle meat mainly because of the certain amino acids found in they've got too much uh, tryptophan anyway, that's getting into the weeds. But for those that want to go that extra PD mile, opting for the more collagenous cuts and ground beef where you have more of it kind of ground up in there anyway, those would be sort of safer paths for protein.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned kind of getting into the weeds with muscle meats and stuff. That was actually something that I realized while I was peating is that I actually do notice kind of more of a stress response when I eat a high concentration of muscle meats. That's not always something that, if somebody asks me about peating, that's not something I'm going to necessarily tell them right off the bat because as you said,
Right.
it can get to a point with peating. It's very scientific. It's very biochemical. It gets to a point where the layperson might feel a bit overwhelmed. A big thing that's always helped me with beating is that number one, the philosophy, it's very holistic. And to me, it's very on its face. I don't even necessarily think Pete would be the type of person who would advise the layperson to get super well versed and to worry themselves about, well, is this muscle meat I'm about to eat going to increase my cortisol response and stuff? It's sometimes with Pete, less is more, right? Sometimes with Pete, having just a few, kind of simple heuristics to help you just improve the position you're at right now can be enough for a person to get into a sort of higher metabolic state, a higher energy state where they feel because and we don't have to talk about learned helplessness or anything like that, but a big thing with Pete is how a lot of times organisms will get trapped into these cycles of learned helplessness. One of these could be, feeling like there's just way too much to tackle in terms of the literature on Pete. And so, well, why even bother if I, I'm never going to be able to understand it all. That would, in a sense, be a form of learned helplessness. So sometimes with Pete, less is more. In our case, we're going to be getting into the weeds on it, guys, because our audience, we're high information voters. And
Read
um,
autistic. No, just
yes,
kidding.
yes. And then on the topic of protein, so I just want to actually throw this note out there. This is totally anecdotal, but in the past, I would say 2 years, I've been really trying to tackle some almost like powerlifting type stuff. I've kind of balanced a little bit between bodybuilding and powerlifting. Trying to get higher strength lifts, but also trying to keep a relatively lean body composition. And I can say through my own experience, the classic bodybuilding and powerlifting advice is, oh, gram per pound, bro. If you weigh 180 pounds, you got to eat 180 grams of protein. But doing 100 grams on Pete, I saw pretty much no change in my performance, which I
Mhm.
was very shocked by. And so that's totally anecdotal, but I figured I would kind of throw it out there.
Yeah, I believe that, and I think that he does talk about some of the problems of excessive protein, and then especially as people get older, you can get by with less protein, and then just ramp up your carbs to take its place. Your fat is another one where the body has certain requirements for, whereas protein it's mostly for kind of like building up the tissues of your body. I think fat is primarily to be thought of as a precursor for certain steroidal hormones. And so saturated fat in particular is a good stable uh, backbone for producing all these other hormones that are part of that kind of positive virtuous cycle, that cascade of progesterone, pregnenolone, um, and I think also probably just sort of again signaling like an environment of abundance, and so both carbs and fat can be used for energy, but I've been leaning in my own life more towards carbs as the primary fuel source throughout the day, And that doesn't mean that I completely restrict fat when I'm eating sugar. And in fact, like the extreme might be something like Anabology's honey diet, aka the fairy princess diet, where you are eating basically nothing but sugar for the first part of the day, no protein, and it has to do with some kind of uh, enzyme that gets triggered if you have protein that I don't know. We won't get into the weeds on that, but uh, maybe up until about three in the if you're doing the strict form, you do it until 3 in the afternoon, nothing but sugar. Then you fast for a few hours, let the insulin levels come down before your evening meal of whatever. It can be a little more flexible on that. And then you just start the cycle over the next day. And for me, this is more workable than the 3 day down cycle, 1 day up cycle of the natural hormone enhancement book, because at least I can just eat a normal dinner with my family
Yeah.
and be a little bit on my own for the earlier part of the day. But there is a risk of one, white knuckling it a little bit, or getting into these extreme glucose spikes. Some people will maybe say you could eat a little gelatin, mix it in with your orange juice, and because it's not a complete protein, it's not gonna, have the effect of that protein would of kind of disrupting your pure sugar burning mode. But this is something people are discovering as a sort of hack that is considered broadly PD, but is compatible with, maybe more rapid weight loss than you would get on the slow burn balanced macros protocol. So I'm
Mhm.
agnostic on that one, but I will say again, the temptation is you really ramp up the sugar, but you're still consuming too much fat throughout the day, and you're inhibiting glucose oxidation via the Randall effect.
Mhm.
So if you're gonna do that, like you kind of do have to commit to it. Maybe a little cream in your coffee, but you can't be, sneaking cheese all day in the kitchen if you're trying the honey diet.
So I want to talk about exercise because obviously, we've been talking a lot about diet this whole time, but any of the lifter bros, they all want to know like what is this going to change any of my lifting? Is this going to change any of my time in the gym? Do I need to be doing things differently? If I want to implement peating into my sort of exercise routine, what would you have to say there? What are the kind of the main things you would want people to have as a takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the big ones that I think a lot of people might already be familiar with. And you mentioned you used to run cross country, and so did I. And I really liked running up until a point. And then I did have a period in when I was having the same kind of chronic fatigue symptoms where I found that the paleo prescription of move frequently at a slow pace and occasionally in intense bursts, that seemed to be much more compatible with like thriving as opposed to this chronic cardio. So that's another area where Mark Sisson and Ray Peat might find some common ground. Um, but it's a little funny because you get things like, okay, well, your resting heart rate is supposedly an indicator of your basal metabolic rate, and that means that a higher pulse is a sign of health, whereas that low pulse that I think is traditionally been associated with elite athletic performance is actually considered to be sort of an adaptation to slowing thyroid and things like that. So that can be a little bit of a tougher pill for some people to swallow, that this point of pride that they have a resting heart rate of, 55, 65 beats per minute might actually be a sign that they're metabolically less than optimal.
What
My
about, real quick, what about blood pressure?
I don't know. I don't know anything about blood pressure really, I
Have
have
you
to admit.
have you seen that video of Andrew Tate where he says they try to tell you that having high blood pressure is a bad thing? Uh, he says he says you're telling me my blood is pumping through my veins at 400 miles per hour. That sounds like I'm supercharged. Yeah. Anyways, no, but
No, it's a good question. That's a very good question.
I
I
actually
don't
heard
know.
I've heard in I think one interview Pete actually mentioned how having a slightly elevated blood pressure actually isn't necessarily as bad as people might think it. So like what might be classified as like hypertension one. Don't take my word for it out there, guys. Take that with a grain of salt. I heard that one time, and just
Salt
totally
raises blood pressure. You got
right.
to be.
Salt raises blood pressure. um, and so okay, so but yeah, on the topic of exercise. So we know that's super intense cardio for very long periods of time. Obviously, that's going to be something that Pete would say is going to raise, stress levels. It's not going to necessarily
Right,
lead
right.
to the outcomes that we are hoping for. But what about things like weightlifting?
Yeah, and one more note on the cardio front. I do think that there is still something to be said for increasing the threshold at which your body starts to produce lactic acid as a sort of byproduct of the, switching into the anaerobic mode. So like and this might be a departure from PI. This is one of the questions that I would have loved to have been able to ask him if he were still alive today. Given, and this will also dovetail with the conversation about weightlifting, because when you lift heavy things, you're engaging anaerobic pathways past a certain point of exertion, and you feel soreness after the fact. You feel that lactic acid. You might be able to mitigate that by doing kind of low reps, low and slow, that sort of thing. And I think that all of that is probably good advice in general, as opposed to like the CrossFit AMRAP, as many reps as possible style workouts where you're like almost chasing after that burn. And
Hmm.
like that is a certain kind of conditioning. But again, I think Pete would say it's a conditioning for a form of stress that most of us neither really have the need to be adapted to. And ultimately, it's not a beneficial adaptation if it requires you to be in this state of, producing so much lactic acid, which is a toxin. But given that our lives do demand physical activity of us, um, wouldn't we want to have some level of conditioning, and wouldn't we want to be able to do the same kinds of activity without triggering lactic acid? So what I've started to do, because I also still enjoy running, is I try to one maintain nasal breathing the whole time, just as a guard against moving past my sort of aerobic threshold into that anaerobic state. I might do like one or two sprints in a 30-minute tempo run, but where most of the time I'm just kind of I'm staying below that nasal breathing threshold where I start to need to, gasp for air. And that's also reducing the amount that you're of CO2 that you're exhaling. And CO2 in the PD framework is kind of like a scarce resource that you want to hang on to a little bit more. Um, let's see, but to take this into the lifting question, I found a couple of interviews where he talks about some Soviet exercise science where they would test the Russian athletes for banned substances, and they found that their testosterone levels were much higher than you would expect to get naturally. But it turned out that it wasn't from taking steroids; it was actually that they had switched over to some methods that where they really reduced the volume, and they just increased the intensity. So maybe I don't know. I'm picturing like these Russian lifters just doing like one lift and then that's it for the month, but it's a really heavy lift or something like that. Or
Yeah.
you joked about what was this thing about Ray
The,
Peat
the,
did would do one pistol squat every 10 years and
yeah.
then
There's a meme, yeah. There's a meme where it says that, Ray Peat he would do one pistol squat every 10 years just to check his leg strength, and then
right.
that was enough. That was enough for, the decade. Um,
Sounds like lore. Sounds like maybe,
yeah.
but no, actually, and I have for a while I've been influenced by Pavel Tsatsouline, who was Russian Kettlebell Club, same sort of line that would have been probably tapping into this insight. And the Soviets were excellent sports scientists. He wrote a whole book on anti-glycolytic training. This whole idea of kind of minimizing the amount of time that you're in that like glycolytic pathway where you're needing to produce lactic acid as a byproduct of the less efficient energy pathway. So I do his greasing the groove, body like, yeah, single leg squats. don't do them as often because I'm not as young as I used to be, but the one arm push-ups I can still knock out a couple of those,
Nice.
and I do think that reducing the volume, reducing the frequency, you can still go a pretty long way towards functional strength. Maybe not as much of the classic bodybuilder look, but depending on
Um,
what you're chasing, that might not be the worst thing.
One name that I wanted to at least bring up in this conversation is Mike Mincer. So, um, and the whole reason why is because so whenever I was in my early kind of bodybuilding days, amateur bodybuilding days in college, it was like the idea was the more that I'm in the gym, the more jacked I'll be. If I'm in the gym for 1 hour, it's not quite as good as if I'm in there for 3 hours. And then, every day per week. But obviously came out of that whole period of life with a lot of chronic injuries. And I realized the value of having more rest time. And like you said, with the Russian um, uh, athletes, how they had figured out that, having a higher intensity but a lower volume of training was actually more efficacious than the other way around. And Mike Mincer, so he was a golden era, bodybuilder. For those of you who don't know, he, competed against Arnold, and his physique is very comparable to Arnold's. Now, obviously, he's, taking steroids and things like that, but he had a very similar approach to bodybuilding, which is essentially he would coach a lot of different uh, of his clients to follow the program he was doing, where it was an incredibly low volume. He was lifting maybe once or twice a week or less, and it was just super high intensity every session. You go till complete failure, and you maybe do one set per exercise. Now, I've my whole life I've just done 3 sets of everything, like anytime I lifted, and in probably the past 6 months, I've tried to implement a little bit of this into my strength training, where I just work up to like one top set of a compound lift, and I just try to PR every session, until I get so many weeks and I can't do that anymore, and then I'll take a deload week. But I've seen massive, massive increases in strength from just dropping the volume down. And
Hmm.
and I went from maybe 6 days a week or like 5 days a week of lifting. Because also there's this classic wisdom in bodybuilding that, oh, you got to train each muscle group at least twice per week, bro. You got to do it. You got to hit bench twice per week. You got to hit squats twice per week. And just dropping it down to like 3 days per week max, and then like one set per compound lift. I've only seen, benefits to the training. You come into each session more well rested, and you can just hit the intensity harder, and you just hit PRs week to week to week. And because I think from a peating perspective, like you have like the David Goggins perspective where it's like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna destroy my body and I'm gonna, you know, uh just yeah, okay, I got you. But he's like, I'm gonna destroy my body and this and that. But the Pete perspective is different. The Pete perspective is essentially one that says it's not necessarily about the quantity of, work that you're doing. It's about the quality, and this
Right.
applies to more than just lifting.
Yeah, and the purpose, vitamin P for purpose or Pete, comes into
Yeah,
the equation too.
exactly.
Because if you're doing something that you hate and resent, that's going to be a lot more stressful. It's going to increase cortisol, suppress testosterone. Whereas if you're doing something fulfilling, I've found great fulfillment, especially in wintertime, around here on this. I live on a kind of 20-acre homestead property where there's a lot of fallen trees and logs that have to be cut up and thrown into these big piles and lit on fire. And sometimes these stumps, like, I could never lift them if it was just a matter of lifting that weight in the gym. But somehow knowing that I need to roll it on top of that big flaming heap of big flaming bonfire, it's like, okay, I can do this. Pump myself up.
Yeah.
And I'd love to go deeper into all, like, why concentric as opposed to eccentric, and the idea of sort of not thinking of it like tearing up your muscles so that they heal, but instead just thinking of it as it's still as an adaptation to an imposed demand. But again, it's part of a framework that doesn't idolize stress for its own sake, Instead, it's about it's just about what is a an organism that uh, go kind of going further up Maslow's hierarchy. So I think the prototypical example of good exercise is like chopping wood, which actually, now that I think about it, that's a very kind of primitive activity in a lot of ways. So that doesn't exactly make my point, but
Yeah. Well, I heard somewhere that, Pete said that chopping wood is actually one of the most de-stress, de-stressful exercises that you can do because you see the results of your work piling up like in a visual sense as it
there
goes
you
on.
go.
So,
Yeah.
got Charlie, thank you for coming on today. It was really a pleasure. I think you helped our audience out a lot. And guys, uh, Charlie, you want to plug any of your work or point anyone to your stuff?
I write on Substack, and it's just my name, charliedeist.com. You can also find me on X at chdeist. And I've been a little dormant lately, but I am working on some stuff related to Ray Peat's ideas behind the scenes. Some very, very big stuff going on that will make his own words, his own ideas, much more accessible. And so basically, you might have seen things like the Peat bot, Brad Cohn's excellent chat bot for Ray Peat, but I'm building something that's a little bit more elaborate, and that traces all of his podcast appearances and makes them queryable. So uh, let's do another one of these sometime. I'd love to go into um, what was it? There was one other thing I wanted to. Oh yeah, the PUFA depletion. I'm gonna do a little more homework on PUFA depletion, and we'll talk about that.
All right, guys, go check out Charlie and Charlie. Thank you.
My pleasure, Parks.